Okay, so our lesson for week one is going to deal with some basic geometry formulas. Some of these may be very familiar to you, and I hope they are. But we're going to make sure we understand the formulas, and then we go about this summer, we're going to do a lot of different problems that have to do with these formulas, and our problems will get harder and harder based on the basic formulas. Okay, so whenever you think about perimeter, what you should always be thinking about is distance around. Okay, the perimeter of something is always the distance around that thing. And the way we find it out, the perimeter of a polygon, which a polygon, if you don't know, is a shape with multiple straight sides. So the perimeter of a polygon is the sum of all the side lengths. The most basic type of polygon that we talk about is a square. And so when we talk about the perimeter of a square, what we know about a square is that all the sides are equal. And we call those S. So the perimeter of a square is S plus S plus S plus S. But using our algebra, if you add S's together 4 times, it's the same as multiplying 4 times S. So whenever you're dealing with a square, you need to know the formula. The perimeter is 4 times one of the side lengths. A rectangle, which a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle more generally usually looks like this. Remember, in a rectangle, we have what we call the length, which is 2 of the sides that are the same or congruent to each other or have equal length. And the other is the width, which is also equal to each other. So if we want to find the perimeter of a rectangle, it's always going to be the length plus the width plus the length plus the width. But because there are 2 lengths and 2 widths represented here, we can rewrite it as 2L plus 2W. So the formula you need to know for this is perimeter of a rectangle is always 2L plus 2W. Okay, we also want to find out what area. And area is always going to be found by the number of squares and the squares always have a specific unit. So they'll either be inch by inch squares or centimeter by centimeter squares or mile by mile squares. Or in general, a lot of times we just say unit squares, which means we don't really tell you exactly what the units is. We just say that all the units are the same. So it's the number of squares that completely cover an area. So if we look at a square itself, well, a square can always be found, first off, it has one square that covers it, and that is itself. But you can also break it down into smaller squares. But because a square has congruent sides, that means you have to have a congruent number of vertical and horizontal squares. So whatever the side length is, so in this case, there are 4 units on this side and 4 units on this side. So the number of squares is just 4 times 4. Right? You got 4 rows of 4, so 4 times 4 equals 16. So our area for a square is always whatever the side is squared. If you look at a rectangle, well, a rectangle, if you break it into squares, and obviously my squares aren't very much squares, but these are just estimations. Assume all these are squares. So in this case, you can break it into 4 vertical squares because you got 4 units on for the width, and you can break it into 7 horizontal squares, so you got 7 units on the length. Because there are 4 rows of 7, that means you get 7 plus 7 plus 7 plus 7, which is 4 times 7, or 28 squares. So our area of a rectangle can always be found just by multiplying the length times the width. In this case, our example there is 7 times 4. So area of a square is always side squared, side times side, and area of a rectangle is always length times width. Because a square is always a rectangle, in a square, your length and your width are both the same. So that's why it's S squared. Okay, the other problem we want to find out area of is a trapezoid. If you don't know what a trapezoid looks something like this. The key thing is these 2 sides are always parallel. We call them one base and then the second base because they're a different length. And then the distance between those two is what we call the height. Now notice these two slanted sides, we don't even consider those when we're talking about area. Now they do matter with perimeter. And if you notice, the H is not part of the outside of that trapezoid. So you add, in the perimeter, you add the two slanted sides, but you don't add the H. But in the area of the trapezoid, and I'm just going to give you this formula, it's always going to be 1/2 times the height, and then you multiply that times base 1 plus base 2. This is a little bit more complicated formula, and you should just go ahead and memorize it. The distance, 1/2 times the distance between the two parallel sides times the sum of those two parallel sides. And you'll be using this on some problems in your assignment. Okay. So